My name is Iris Nakamura. I am 40 years old, and I am standing in a gallery on Alberta Street in Portland, looking at my dead mother's painting on a wall with an auction tag on it. The gallery is called Meridian Contemporary. It is the kind of space that converts old warehouse architecture into something that costs more per square foot than it has any right to. White walls, concrete floors, track lighting that hits everything at an angle designed to make you feel like what you are looking at is more significant than it might otherwise be. There are 12 people in the room. A woman with a glass of white wine explaining something to a man with a beard. A couple taking photographs. A gallerist near the door who has not yet noticed that I have stopped. The painting is 48 inches by 60 inches. Oil on canvas. A woman standing at a kitchen window looking out at a garden, her back to the viewer, morning light coming through the glass in the particular way my mother painted light diffuse, sourceless, as if it came from inside the subject rather than from outside. My mother painted it in 2009. I watched her paint it. I was 30 years old and visiting from Portland, and I sat at her kitchen table for 3 days while she worked, and we talked about everything and nothing, and I drank her coffee and she painted. The auction tag says, Keiko Nakamura, Morning Garden, 2009, estimate, $18,000, $24,000. My brother Conrad told me 8 months ago that our mother's art collection had been disposed of. He said it was in storage and that the storage facility had been cleared. He said the pieces were not significant enough to warrant an estate appraisal. He said he had handled it. But here is what none of them knew. The night my mother died, I had walked through her studio and written down every piece in a notebook, 41 works, titles, dimensions, media, my best estimate of condition. I had done it automatically, the way I document everything, because I am a documentary filmmaker, and documentation is the reflex I cannot turn off even in grief. That notebook was in my bag when I walked into this gallery. This is how it happened. Welcome back to my channel, where we share real-life stories about family justice, quiet strength, and the moments that change. If this is your first time here, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a story. To understand what happened in that gallery on Alberta Street, and what happened in an Oregon courtroom 11 months later, you have to understand what it means to be a documentarian who discovers that the most important story she will ever investigate is the one happening inside her own family. I make documentary films about things that are being hidden. That is the simplest accurate description of my work. I have spent 16 years finding stories that someone does not want told and telling them with enough precision and enough evidence that they cannot be dismissed. I have made 4 feature documentaries, one about predatory lending practices in rural or one about the disappearance of indigenous language documentation in the Pacific Northwest, one about a mismanaged state foster care system that won a regional journalism award in 2019, and one about pharmaceutical pricing that is still making its way through the festival circuit. I am not famous. I am known in the circles where this kind of work is known. I am trusted by the people who trust this kind of work. That is sufficient. My mother was Keiko Nakamura. She was a painter, not famous, not commercially successful in the way that word usually means, but genuinely good in a way that the people who knew her work understood and valued. She was second-generation Japanese-American, born in Portland in 1952, trained at the Oregon College of Art and spent 40 years making work in a studio in her house in the Sellwood neighborhood. She painted domestic interiors, primarily kitchens, gardens, rooms where ordinary life happened at ordinary hours, rendered with a precision of light that made the ordinary feel like something worth stopping for. She died in January 2 years ago. She was 71. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, progressed quickly. I was with her for the last 3 weeks. I flew back to Portland from a production in Chicago, and I stayed until she was gone, and then I stayed for 3 more weeks after that, because leaving felt wrong, and I did not know yet how to do it. Conrad is 5 years older than me. He is 45. He lives in Seattle, where he has worked in commercial real estate for 20 years. He is good at commercial real estate in the particular way of someone who understands that property is about narrative as much as square footage, who you tell the story to, how you frame what something is worth, what you omit, and what you emphasize. He has always been good at that. I noted this about him as a child and considered it a gift, and have spent the last 11 months understanding it differently. Conrad handled the estate. This was, at the time, a reasonable arrangement. He is the eldest. He lives closer to the family's institutional relationships in Seattle, and I was in the early months of grief and production simultaneously, finishing the pharmaceutical documentary while also being the person who had just lost her mother. I let Conrad handle it because I was overwhelmed, and because he was my brother, and because I trusted him the way you trust people you have known your entire life, with the accumulated trust of 40 years of shared history. I did not read the estate documents carefully. I reviewed them, signed where I was asked to sign, and moved forward. That is the honest account of what I did and what I did not do. The estate included the house in Selwood, a modest retirement account, and what Conrad described as Mom's art stuff, the 41 works in her studio, and the works hung throughout the house. He said an appraiser had looked at them and found nothing of significant market value. He said he had arranged for the storage and eventual disposal of the collection. He said I could take anything I wanted personally before the storage was cleared. I took 3 paintings, the one of my grandmother's hands, the early self-portrait from 1978, a small landscape of the Columbia River Gorge that my mother had made the year I was born. I did not take the kitchen window painting. I had looked at it for a long time in her studio, and I had not been able to decide, and then Conrad said the storage crew was coming, and I said I needed more time, and he said he would hold it, and then the storage was cleared, and Conrad said everything was gone. I believed him for 4 months. 4 months of grief in which Conrad was the person who had handled everything, and I was the person who had made a documentary in the interstitial spaces of the worst year of my life. 4 months in which I did not ask questions because I had trusted him to handle it, and because asking questions felt, in the weight of grief, like an accusation I did not want to make against my own brother. Yemi Adeyemi has been my research assistant and production coordinator for 6 years. She is 32, originally from Lagos, trained in documentary production at Portland State, and she is the best researcher I have ever worked with, methodical, tireless, and possessed of the particular instinct for finding the document that should exist, but that someone has tried to make not exist. She has worked on 3 of my 4 films. She knows my working methods the way a surgical nurse knows a surgeon's hands. My editing suite is in a shared production space in the Pearl District. It smells like equipment and coffee, and the particular focus of people doing concentrated work in adjacent rooms. I spend most of my working hours there. It is where I am most myself in the footage, in the evidence, in the work of making something that is true and provable and impossible to dismiss. My mother's kitchen window painting was sold at auction by a Seattle firm called Hartwell Contemporary Art for $21,400. I know this because I found the auction record. I found it because I am a documentarian and finding records is what I do. And because walking into Meridian Contemporary on a Tuesday evening in September and seeing my mother's painting on a wall with an auction tag on it had done something to the 4 months of trusted grief that I had been living in. I had gone to Meridian Contemporary because Yemi had mentioned it. She had been to an opening the previous week and said there was interesting work, someone I might want to see for a future project. I went on a Tuesday evening because I had finished a cut of a short piece, and I needed to be somewhere that was not my editing suite and was not my apartment, and that had things worth looking at on the walls. I walked in at 7:15. I took a glass of water from the table I walked the perimeter of the room the way I walk every room systematically, left to right, looking at what is there. I saw it when I got to the third wall. I knew it immediately. Not because of the style, though the style was unmistakably my mother's. Because of the specific quality of light coming through the painted kitchen window, the angle of it, the way it fell on the painted woman's shoulder. I had sat in that kitchen for 3 days in 2009, watching that light move across my mother's canvas. I had drunk 3 pots of her coffee in that kitchen. I knew that light the way I know my own handwriting. I walked to it. I stood in front of it. I read the auction tag. Keiko Nakamura. Morning Garden. 2009, estimate $18,000 to $24,000. I stood there for a long time. The gallery continued around me. The woman with the wine was still explaining something. The couple was still taking photographs. The gallerist near the door had still not noticed me. I took out my phone. I photographed the painting. I photographed the auction tag. I photographed the wall label. I did this automatically, the reflex that does not, the documentarian's instinct that says before you feel anything you make the record. Then I put my phone in my bag, and I walked to the bathroom at the back of the gallery, and I stood at the sink with my coat on, and my purse still on my shoulder, and I leaned over the sink, and I looked at my own face in the mirror for 10 minutes, and I did not move. I was thinking about Conrad saying the storage had been cleared. I was thinking about nothing of significant market value. I was thinking about 4 months of trusting him to handle it, and him handling it in a way that had resulted in my mother's painting being on a wall in a gallery in Portland with an auction tag on it 8 months after her death. I was thinking about the notebook the night my mother died, a Wednesday in January, 3 in the morning. The house quiet in the way houses are quiet when something enormous has just happened in them. I had walked through her studio because I could not be in the room where she had been, and I could not be outside the house, and the studio was the room that was most hers and most alive with her. And I had needed to be in. I had walked through the studio with my phone flashlight, and I had written down every piece, not because I was thinking about the estate. I was not thinking about the estate. I was thinking about my mother, who had spent 40 years making things in this room, and I was walking through the things she had made, and I was writing them down because I did not want them to be unrecorded, and I am a person for whom the unrecorded is the closest thing I have to a definition of loss. 41 works. Titles where I knew them, dimensions estimated. Condition described in the flat terms I use when I describe footage: usable, damaged, excellent, requires attention. I had that notebook in my bag on a Tuesday evening in September when I stood at a gallery sink for 10 minutes with my coat on. When I came out of the bathroom, I found the gallerist. I said I was interested in the Nakamura piece. I asked about provenance. She said it had come through a Seattle auction house, Hartwell Contemporary Art. She said the consignor was a private collector. She said the piece had sold 2 weeks prior. The tag was a sold notation. The piece was being held for collection. I said, "Who was the consignor?" She said she couldn't disclose that. I said, "I understand. Thank you." I walked out of Meridian Contemporary onto Alberta. The September Portland evening was cool and smelled like the particular combination of rain and coffee and city that Portland evenings always smell like. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then I called Yemi. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I need you to find the Hartwell Contemporary Art auction records for the past 8 months. Keiko Nakamura. Every piece." She said, "When did you need it?" I said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Okay." I walked to my car. I drove to my editing suite. I sat at my desk at 9 in the evening, and I opened the notebook I had written in on the night my mother died, and I started counting. Yemi delivered the Hartwell Contemporary auction records the following afternoon. She had accessed them through the auction house's public sales database. supplemented by 3 targeted records requests that she knew how to file because she had filed similar requests for 3 of my documentaries. She set the printed records on my desk at 2 in the afternoon and said, 23 pieces. I looked at the records. 23 works attributed to Keiko Nakamura, sold through Hartwell Contemporary Art over a 7-month period. The earliest sale was 6 weeks after my mother's death. The most recent was 3 weeks before I walked into Meridian Contemporary and found the kitchen window painting. Total realized at auction, $1.4 million. Not the auction estimates, the realized prices. My mother's work had found its market in death the way many artists' work does the retrospective attention, the reassessment, the recognition that arrives when the artist is no longer available to be overlooked. Conrad had told me the collection was not significant enough to warrant an estate appraisal. He had said this knowing that the collection had already been consigned to a Seattle auction house 6 weeks after our mother died. He had said this while 23 pieces were being catalogued and photographed and described in Hartwell's auction listings as the complete collection of a significant Pacific Northwest artist whose work had been critically undervalued during her lifetime. I looked at the Hartwell listings for a long time. Each piece was described accurately and in detail my mother's style, her technique, the quality of her light. Someone had written these descriptions who knew her work. I read them the way I read transcripts looking for the thing underneath the thing, the detail that tells you who knows what. The consignor was listed as a private party in each sale. Yemi Cross referenced the consignment account number across all 23 listings. The same account number appeared on every consignment. She ran the account registration through the Washington State Business Records database. The consignor was a single-member LLC registered in Seattle in February, 1 month after my mother's death. The sole member was Conrad Nakamura. I sat with that for a moment. Then I called my probate attorney. Her name was Sandra Park, a Portland attorney, who had handled estate litigation for 22 years and who had been recommended to me by a colleague at the Oregon Journalism Foundation. I had her on retainer from 3 months earlier when I had first begun to suspect that the estate settlement was not what Conrad had represented. I had retained her before I had evidence. I retained her because I am a documentarian, and I retain resources before I know I need them, because the moment you need them is too late to find them. Sandra said, "How solid is the consignor connection?" I said, "The LLC registration is public record. The consignment account matches across all 23 transactions. I have the notebook from the night she died with all 41 works inventoried. 23 of those 41 are in the Hartwell auction records." She said, "The notebook is critical." "When was it written?" I said, "The night she died, January 14th. I can verify the creation date on the digital file I made from it. I photographed every page that week." She said, "You photographed your handwritten inventory." I said, "I photograph everything." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Iris, that notebook is the cleanest piece of evidence I have seen walk into my office in 11 years. The legal framework Sandra applied was conversion the civil tort for the wrongful taking and disposition of someone else's property. In probate terms, Conrad had taken assets from our mother's estate, which he had a fiduciary duty to preserve and distribute according to the estate documents, and had converted them to his own benefit through the LLC. The civil conversion claim, combined with a probate fraud allegation, gave us 2 independent theories. The estate documents Conrad had submitted to the probate court had listed the art collection as disposed of with no realized value. This was false. The realized value was $1.4 million, documented in the Hartwell auction records. The discrepancy between the probate filing and the auction records constituted fraud upon the court. I spent the next 7 months building the documentary record the way I build every documentary record systematically, with every source identified and every document verified. Yemi worked alongside me for 4 of those months, treating it like a production with her characteristic methodical focus. She found the Hartwell cataloger, who had written the listing descriptions, a woman named Patricia Cho, who had corresponded with Conrad by email about the collection, and who, when Yemi contacted her through the Journalism Foundation's source protocol, agreed to provide those emails as evidence. The Patricia Cho emails showed Conrad describing the collection to Hartwell as his mother's estate art, confirming his authority to consign as a state representative, and selecting which pieces to bring to market first, based on Hartwell's assessment of current demand. The first email was dated 12 days after my mother's death. Sandra deposed Conrad in June. I was not present for the deposition, but I read the transcript the same day it was delivered. Conrad's responses were careful. He was a real estate professional who understood transactions and documentation and who had prepared. But the documents were more careful than he was. The LLC registration, the consignment emails, the auction records, the notebook. There was one night in March, 4 months into the evidence building, when I was in my editing suite at 11 at night, watching the Hartwell auction footage that Yemi had obtained from the auction house's public recording of their events. The footage showed Conrad's 23 pieces being sold one by one. Lot 12 was my mother's kitchen window painting. I watched a room of collectors bid on it. I watched the hammer fall at $21,400. I watched a piece my mother painted while I sat at her kitchen table in 2009 change hands in 30 seconds. I turned off the monitor. I sat in the dark editing suite for a while, then I turned it back on and kept working. Yemi, during this period, was the witness who did not solve. She came to the editing suite every morning with her own coffee and worked at her station on the research and said nothing about the personal dimensions of what we were building unless I opened that door. Once, in April, I opened the door. I said, "I found a voicemail from Conrad, from the day she died." Yemi looked up. I said, "He was devastated." "You can hear it." She said, "I know." I said, "It doesn't change what he did." She said, "No, but it's true at the same time." I said, "Yes." That was the conversation. It was sufficient. I had found the voicemail while clearing old messages in February. Conrad's voice, the day our mother died, calling me before I had landed in Portland. "Iris, it's me. Call me when you land." "She's just call me." His voice had the particular broken quality of a person who has just witnessed something irreversible and has not yet found the language for it. I had heard that quality in interview subjects for 16 years. It was real. It was real, and he had registered an LLC 12 days later. People contain both things. I had been documenting this truth for 16 years in other people's lives. It was harder to document it in my brother's. For 11 months I showed up. Conrad came to Portland in April for what he described as a family matter, clearing the last of the Selwood house before the new owners took possession. The house had been sold as part of the estate settlement. I met him there on a Saturday morning. We walked through the empty rooms together. The studio was the walls where my mother's paintings had hung had the particular ghost of removed art, slightly different paint tone, the ghost of hanging hardware. I looked at the walls and I thought about 23 auction records and Patricia Cho's emails and the notebook in my bag. Conrad said, "It's strange without her stuff on the walls." I said yes. He said, "She had so much." We drove to a diner in Selwood afterward and ate breakfast, and he talked about a commercial property deal he was working on in Bellevue, and I talked about the pharmaceutical documentaries festival run, and we were 2 siblings eating breakfast after clearing their mother's house. And everything we said was true, and nothing we said was the most important thing. He paid for breakfast. He always pays. It is one of his habits, and I have always received it as generosity, and am now uncertain what it was. In June, my cousin Hannah visited from Seattle. She had been close to my mother, and she wanted to talk about the particular need that grief produces for someone who knew the person and can speak about them with specificity. We walked along the waterfront and talked about my mother's paintings for Hannah said she wished she had bought one when she had the chance. She said she had always loved the kitchen window piece. I said, that one was beautiful. I did not say anything else. Hannah did not know about the auction records, and I was not yet ready to tell anyone outside Sandra's office. I listened to Hannah talk about my mother's paintings, and I held what I knew, and I kept walking. July was Conrad called on my birthday. He sang the first line of Happy Birthday the way he has sung it every year since I was 7 years old off key, without apology, completely himself. He asked about the festival circuit. He asked if I was dating anyone. He said he was proud of the pharmaceutical documentary. I said thank you. I said things were going well. I said I would call him next week. I did not call him next week. I sent a text 2 weeks later that said I had been swamped with a new project. He sent back a thumbs up emoji and a line about maybe coming to Portland in the fall. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Your story matters too. The hardest moment came in August. I was at my editing suite, and Yemi brought me the final piece of evidence, the complete Hartwell payment records, obtained through Sandra's formal discovery process, showing the deposit trail from the 23 auction sales into Conrad's LLC account, and from there into his personal account. $1.4 million over 7 months. She set the records on my desk and said, "That's everything." I looked at the records. I thought about my mother painting for 40 years in a studio in Selwood. I thought about the 22 years of not finding her market, of making work that was genuinely good and not commercially recognized, of painting because painting was what she did and not because it paid what it should have. I thought about the market finding her in death, in the retrospective attention that comes too late. The $4 million that arrived after she was gone and went into an LLC my brother had registered 12 days after her funeral. I sat with all of that for a few minutes. Then I said, "Okay, we have everything. Tell Sandra we're ready." Sandra called on a Wednesday morning in September, 11 months after I had walked into Meridian Contemporary. I was in my editing suite, reviewing footage for a new project. She said, "Conrad's attorney called this morning. They want to discuss a resolution before we file." I said, "What are they proposing?" She said, "They're not proposing specifics yet. They want a meeting." His attorney said Conrad is prepared to acknowledge that the estate handling was her word was imperfect. I said, "Imperfect?" She said, "Yes." I thought about that word for a moment. Imperfect, 23 pieces. $4 million. An LLC registered 12 days after the funeral. Patricia Cho's emails. The notebook I had written on the night my mother died. I said, "Tell them we'll meet. But we file if the meeting doesn't produce a full accounting and complete restitution." She said, "Understood." I put the phone down. I turned back to the footage on my... It was a different project, early stages, a story about water rights in eastern Oregon, footage of a river in late afternoon light, the particular quality of light on moving water in the early fall. My mother had painted water, not often, but occasionally the Columbia River Gorge piece she had made the year I was born, the one I had taken from her studio. I had it on the wall of my apartment. I looked at it every morning. I thought about the 23 pieces I had not taken. I thought about the kitchen window painting that I had not been able to decide about, and that I had let Conrad say he would hold, and that had sold at Hartwell for $21,400. I called Yemi. I said, "They want to meet before we file." She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Meet, but we go in with everything." She said, "I'll pull the binders." That evening I drove to the Selwood neighborhood, not to the house the new owners had taken possession. I parked on Guilford and walked to the corner where you could see the top of the oak tree in the front yard of my mother's house, which was the same oak tree that had been in the yard my entire life and that belonged to the yard regardless of who owned the house. I stood there for a few minutes. Then I drove home and made dinner and called Patricia Osai. I called Dr. Patricia Osai, my mentor. I told her the meeting was scheduled. She asked how I was. I said I was ready. She said, "You've been ready for 11 months. I said, yes. The meeting was on a Thursday in October in Sandra's conference room. Conrad came from Seattle with his attorney, a woman named Deborah Marsh who had the bearing of someone who had reviewed the evidence file and understood the position she was managing. Conrad was in a gray jacket and the particular expression of a man who has been thinking about this meeting for longer than the meeting has been scheduled. He sat down across from me and looked at the table for a moment, and then looked at me. I looked back at him. He was 45 and he had our mother's eyes and he had registered an LLC 12 days after her funeral. I held both of those things without resolving them into something simpler than they were. Sandra set the evidence binders on the table. She set the notebook, the photographed copy, the original with the January date on it on top. She said, "I want to walk through the documentation before we discuss terms." Deborah Marsh said her client was prepared to discuss a full resolution. Sandra said, "Good, then we'll want him to understand the complete scope of what we have." She walked through it methodically, the 41-piece inventory from the night of Keiko Nakamura's death. The 23 Hartwell auction records. The LC registration dated 12 days post-death. The Patricia Cho emails documenting Conrad's authority representations to the auction house. The payment records showing $1.4 million in realized sales deposited to Conrad's personal account. The probate filing that had listed the collection as disposed of with no realized value. She set each document on the table as she described it. By the end, there were 17 documents in a row between us and Conrad. Conrad was looking at the notebook. He said, quietly, not to Deborah Marsh, not to Sandra, "You wrote that the night she died." I said, "Yes," he said. "I didn't know you did that." I said, "I know." There was a silence. Deborah Marsh began a sentence about the estate representative's discretionary authority, and Sandra set the Patricia Cho emails on top of the pile and said, "These emails establish that Mr. Nakamura represented his authority to consign the collection while simultaneously filing a probate document stating the collection had been disposed of with no value. The Oregon revised statutes governing personal representative conduct are specific about the fiduciary duty to the estate. We are prepared to file for full removal of the personal representative, surcharge for the full amount of misappropriated estate assets, and referral of the probate fraud allegation to the Oregon State Bar for Conrad's attorney, who prepared the probate filing." Deborah Marsh looked at the email. She looked at the probate filing Sandra had placed beside them. She said, "Can we take a recess?" The recess took 40 minutes. Yemi and I waited in Sandra's lobby. Yemi brought coffee from the place on the corner without being asked. We sat in the lobby chairs and I looked at the artwork on Sandra's waiting room walls. Local artists, Pacific Northwest landscapes, the kind of work that gets bought for offices and represents a sincere if modest engagement with the region's visual culture, and I thought about my mother painting for 40 years in a studio in Selwood for the love of what painting was and not for what it returned. When we went back in, Deborah Marsh said her client was prepared to make full restitution. The terms took 2 hours to negotiate. Conrad would return to the estate the full $1.4 million in realized auction proceeds. He would fund the recovery, through Hartwell's cooperation, of any unsold pieces from the 23 consigned. 4 pieces remained in the auction pipeline and would be withdrawn. He would correct the probate filing. He would pay Sandra's his role as personal representative would be formally terminated and an independent administrator appointed to close the estate. The kitchen window painting, which had sold to a private collector in Seattle, was located through Hartwell's buyer records. Sandra contacted the buyer's attorney. The buyer, upon learning the provenance circumstances, agreed to return the painting in exchange for the $21,400 purchase price, which would be deducted from Conrad's restitution total. Conrad signed the agreement at 4:15. He gathered his jacket from the back of the chair. Deborah Marsh was reviewing the signature pages. He looked at me across the table. He said, "I told myself the money would have just she didn't care about money. You know that. She never cared about selling." I looked at him. I said, "She cared about the work existing. That's different." He nodded once. He did not say anything else. He walked out. Deborah Marsh followed. Sandra closed the conference room door. Yemi was beside me. She said, "You got everything." I said, "Not everything. 4 pieces are still out there." She said, "4 we know about." I said, "Yes, the $1.4 million was returned to the estate account in December, in 2 transfers, as specified in the agreement." The independent estate administrator, a Portland attorney named Marcus Obi, oversaw the distribution. My share, under Oregon intestate succession law with the corrected estate valuation, was $612,000. I have not spent most of it. I set aside what I needed for the production company and put the rest in an account I labeled in the way my mother labeled things, by what it was for, not by what it was. I called it her work. The 4 pieces withdrawn from the Hartwell pipeline were returned to the estate. 3 of them I sold through a reputable Portland gallery that specializes in Pacific Northwest artists, and that had already been approached by collectors interested in my mother's work following the Hartwell sales. The 4th, a small painting of a bowl of persimmons on a kitchen table, 12 inches by 16 inches, oil on board I kept. The kitchen window painting arrived at my apartment in February in a wooden crate that the Seattle collector's assistant delivered personally. I opened the crate in my living room. The painting was exactly as I remembered it: the woman at the window, the morning light, the garden. I held it for a moment. Then I drove it to a framer I trust in the Pearl District, and I left it there for 2 weeks, and when it came back it had a frame that suited it, and I hung it in my editing suite above my main monitor. My cousin Hannah called in January when the estate correction became public record. Probate records are public in Oregon, and she had looked. She said, "I saw what happened." I said yes. She said, "I'm sorry." I said I was too. She said, "She would have been, I don't know. She would have been something." I said I thought so too. Conrad and I have not spoken since the conference room. I hold the possibility that we will, eventually, and I do not insist on a timeline for it. He is 45, and he lost his mother, and he responded to that loss in a way that required me to spend 11 months building a case against him. I can hold his grief and his actions in the same frame without one canceling the other. I have been documenting that particular human complexity for 16 years. It does not become simpler when it is your own family. Patricia, my mentor, who I called every few weeks through the 11 months, came to the editing suite in March to see the kitchen window painting. She stood in front of it for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "She got the light right." I said I knew. She said, "Is this the one you watched her paint?" I said yes. She said, "Then it was always supposed to be yours." I thought about that afterward. Always supposed to be yours. As if the 41 pieces in the studio inventory had their destinations written into them. As if my mother painting a kitchen window in 2009, while I sat at her table drinking her coffee, had already decided that I would be the one to bring it home. I do not know if that is true. I know that I wrote down 41 pieces in a notebook on the night she died because I could not let the record be incomplete. And I know that the notebook was in my bag when I walked into a gallery on Alberta Street and found a piece of what was missing. The new documentary I am working on is about estate fraud in Pacific Northwest families, specifically the intersection of art collections, cognitive decline, and the fiduciary failures of family estate representatives. I am not making it about my family. I am making it about the pattern, which is larger than my family, and which I am in a position to document with a particular understanding of the subject matter. My mother's kitchen window painting is above my monitor while I work. The morning light in it diffuse, sourceless, as if from inside the subject rather than from outside, is the first thing I see when I sit down at my desk. I used to think that documentation was professional, that it was what I did at work, and that the rest of my life operated on different terms: trust, family, the accumulated shorthand of 40 years of shared history with the people who knew me before I became the person I am now. I do not think that anymore. Documentation is not professional. It is the honest accounting of what exists. It is the reflex I turned on in my mother's studio on the night she died, not because I was thinking about evidence, but because I could not let 41 years of her work go unrecorded in the hours immediately after she stopped making it. I walked through her studio with a phone flashlight and I wrote down what was there, because to not write it down would have been a form of loss I could not accept. That notebook was the thing that made everything else possible. Not the legal strategy, not the deposition, not the 17 documents on the conference room table. The notebook written at 3 a.m. in grief that had not yet found its shape. I have been telling other people's stories for 16 years. I have been asking people to document their experiences, to create the record that makes the truth provable rather than just felt. I have asked this of vulnerable people and afraid people and people who did not believe the record would make a difference. I have asked it, and I have been right about it enough times to keep asking. On the night my mother died, I asked it of myself without knowing I was asking it. The reflex that built a career took a notebook into a studio at 3 a.m. and wrote down 41 titles in handwriting I can verify against 16 years of my own notebooks, and created the thing that brought the work home. There is a painting above my monitor. A woman at a kitchen window, morning light coming through the glass, the garden behind her. I sat at her table for 3 days and drank her coffee, and we talked about everything and nothing. The painting holds all of that, the 3 days, the coffee, the nothing and everything conversations in the particular way that art holds things, not by recording them but by being made in the presence of them. I used to think the hardest stories to tell were the ones with the most ets. I now think the hardest stories are the ones where you are also the subject, where the documentarian and the person being documented are the same, and you have to apply the same standard you would apply to anyone else's life, follow the evidence, verify the record, tell the truth about what you find. I followed the evidence. I verified the record. This is what I found. That is my story. A documentary filmmaker who spent 11 months investigating her own family and learned that the most important record she ever kept was the one she made on the night of the worst day of her life. If this reminded you that the truth is worth documenting especially when you are afraid of what it will show, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.